Hi, I'm Professor Nathan Jensen at University of Texas at Austin, and I'm talking about how to create green jobs, lessons from U.S. state and local economic development. U.S. states and cities spend between $45 and $90 billion per year on economic development, most of them economic development incentives. And we've learned a lot from that. And in this memo, I'm talking about 8 different lessons from this kind of interesting laboratory of economic development. Lesson number 1. And maybe this seems really obvious, but programs should have clear goals that are measurable. And that seems obvious, but many cities and states don't have clear goals. One study found only 4% of economic development programs have these goals, and there can be goal conflict, right? So giving a tax incentive for capital, right, like much of the Inflation Reduction Act, can actually lead to a loss of jobs because it substitutes capital for labor. You lower the cost of capital and you either leave or increase the cost of labor. So there's this goal conflict, and that's why it's important to state very clearly what your goals are. The second is that, again, going to sound obvious, you should actually identify what are the barriers. Are the barriers costs? Is it financing? Or are the barriers something else? In many cases, it's skill gaps. So workforce development programs can be much more effective. Number 3, upfront subsidies are much more efficient than long tax abatements. And this is really important because many tax abatements are 10-year tax abatements for companies that have short time horizons and very high discount rates. It's better to move incentives upfront, like the U.S. CHIPS Act, as opposed to long tax abatements. The other important, and this is number 4, important is targeting. How do you target economic development in a way that companies are responding to the incentives and not just doing what they're going to do anyways? And in the memo, I review some literature showing that the vast majority of companies were going to invest even without incentives. And how do you do a better job targeting? And how do you figure out whether it works, a program works or doesn't work, when you know many of the firms are going to participate anyways? Be aware of complex programs that encourage rent seeking. I talk about this in the memo. Having direct payments to companies is much more efficient than having transfers. Allowing a company to transfer their tax credit to another company generates rent seeking in a way that you can think about TurboTax, right? The idea that complex programs where middlemen capture a lot of the benefits. The others include, you build programs that include evaluations and sunsets. So a program ends, and before it ends, you evaluate it. This is Economic Development 101, but not always structured in many programs, and many of the IRA programs do not have either sunsets or any evaluations. The other, and maybe this is like very broad, don't miss opportunities to couple other goals with economic development. We have a Tesla Gigafactory here in Austin, Texas. You can't get to it by public transportation. You could encourage that through economic development programs, especially if they're discretionary programs. Give extra bonus points for projects that locate near public transit. And then finally, and I think this is one of the most important, incentives at one level of government affect incentives at other levels of government. There are bidding wars for EV factories. There are competitions across states for solar and wind projects. And in some ways, the unintended consequence of programs like the IRA, if not well designed, is it can generate even more tax incentives at the state and local level, which can harm taxpayers, but in many places it's school districts that are paying a large percentage of tax incentives. So those are my quick 8 lessons for economic development. Again, I talk in more detail in the memo, but the idea behind this is we've learned a lot over the past few decades, and we can incorporate this to make better public policy. Thank you very much for listening.